Welcome to a series dedicated to the theories of personality. These videos take up an introductory analysis of those approaches to personality that have had a significant impact on the field of psychology. Today's video draws from Franz Fanon's work, Black Skin, White Masks. This video is not intended to be a comprehensive summary of Fanon's thought, even within the work that we're considering here today. There have been more and better presentations available out there on YouTube. Instead, I'm approaching this thinker for what I think he has to say to the field of psychology and its theories of personality, and I'll be approaching my analysis from within this lens. A purpose of this book is to examine the experience of Black individuals in racist societies. However, Fanon is cautious to note that what he has to say is not some universal and timeless truth. He's not exploring an issue related to human nature, but instead taking a specific historical problem, which is how racism in post-colonial societies dehumanizes Black people and, in a different way, white people. He draws from philosophy, especially Hegel and Jean-Paul Sartre, as well as psychology and psychoanalysis. The answer to this question is suggested by the title, Black Skin, White Masks. Fanon argues that racism dehumanizes people of color. This in turn affects how Black people see themselves, whereby they're not only made acutely aware of their identity of being Black, but wrestle with the ambiguity of what it means to be human in a context where others are dehumanizing them. Consequently, an internal urge may emerge to become more white so as to feel more human. Another issue addressed was French cultural representations of heroes as white, denying young Black children of Black heroes and communicating that one must become white to be accepted. This, Fanon argues, contributes to a loss of agency and a sense of self. The Black person is alienated and divided between their heritage and identity, as there's a kind of pressure to put forth a certain persona of whiteness in order to be accepted. At the same time, but in a very different way, Fanon argues that white people also fail to realize their own humanity, but in this case, it is due to the dehumanizing activities that they are engaging in. Fanon claims that this dynamic expresses itself at the level of psychology through the experience of what he calls inferiority and superiority complexes. These terms are derived from the psychoanalyst Alfred Adler, who, like Carl Jung, was a former disciple of Freud, but rejected Freud's theory. An inferiority complex consists of a pervasive and intense feeling of inadequacy and negative self-concept related to beliefs in being in some way less than others. This complex then leads to a variety of compensatory actions that seek to overcome such feeling. According to Adler, this forms the basis of personality and can motivate healthy, normal striving and development. But when taken to an extreme, it forms the basis for what is called neurosis. The superiority complex is not opposed to the inferiority complex, but is another mode of its manifestation. An individual with a superiority complex has an inferiority complex, but has developed defense mechanisms and compensatory strategies that lead that individual to outwardly display a sense of superiority over others to conceal feelings of inferiority. Though Fanon is generally favorable toward these concepts by Adler, he does reject Adler's focus on individual psychology, and instead argues that these complexes derive from political and especially economic conditions. The economic hierarchy in a racist society corresponds to a hierarchy of social values, and it's a primary factor in producing an inferiority complex. Now, this is not merely a matter of economic impoverishment, nor is it a matter of being in the minority versus having a majority status. Fanon points out that in South Africa, white people are the overwhelming minority and yet experience a social superiority over the majority African population. For this question, you might think that this is a relatively straightforward answer, but it's not. Addressing why requires exploring Fanon's examination of power in language. Fanon states that language perpetuates feelings of inferiority, especially in a colonial context. In Fanon's case, he wrote this book in the French language, the language of the colonizing people. The French language stood for civilization and education, and teaching French was a primary means of assimilating colonized people to the culture that represented superiority. As Fanon is a black man writing in the French language, he's both addressing and at the same time performing this problematic relation to language. He argues in French that speaking French as a black person is a negotiation in cultural belonging, leading him to be in a kind of double bind. This concept of the double bind, developed by Gregory Bateson, was intended to be a theory concerning the origins of schizophrenia, though subsequent research has not supported such a claim. The concept itself refers to a situation in which the overt message contradicts the covert one. A parent might ask their child, "How about you play baseball?" But only if you want to. However, if the child was not to play baseball, the parent might become angry and aggressive toward the child for reasons that seem inexplicable, but are in fact due to the child's choice. These double messages create a kind of inner tension as the meta-communication is discordant from the overt communication. In Fanon's situation, he knows he must write in French to be read by the white French. But on the other hand, he also knows he'll never be accepted as French. And as such, he engages in a complicated dance between language and racial identity. So with this in mind, let's try to answer this question. Who is this book written for? In a sense, it was written for both a black and white audience, but for different reasons and in different ways. He both wants to show white French how they have dehumanized themselves in dehumanizing others. He also wants to show his black readers how they are being dehumanized and how this leads to attempts to identify with white culture, which can contribute to feelings of alienation and inner tension. Addressing these two audiences requires a kind of code switching. He will at times speak of we in the sense of what he calls his colored brothers and sisters. And yet, this is an ambivalent we, because in enunciating the we, he's both joining those he identifies with, and yet at the same time assuming a perspective of white French culture that looks upon black people as a homogeneous group. In contrast, the African Caribbean culture is not the same as the African American culture, and both are different from the South African context, etc. And so this we, as referring to his colored brothers and sisters, is inherently an ambivalent we. That is itself a product of racist society. He also sometimes says we in identifying with the white French people, being himself a citizen of France. Yet, he also recognizes that he knows he's not going to be accepted as one of them. Now, one additional complicating factor to all this should be mentioned here. We have a black Caribbean man writing in the French language, trying to communicate and identify with different groups in different ways. Now, let us take into account that you currently have a white man discussing Fanon's thought, and we've just added another level of complexity that places this discussion in an even more precarious situation, fraught with pitfalls due to my own admittedly limited understanding and inevitable biases, some of which I'm not completely aware of. So as a reader, I'm forced to ask myself, how is Fanon trying to address me? And indeed, how is he trying to address me as a white man? As such, reading Fanon for me has to be a form of self-critique and self-questioning that never ceases throughout an engagement with his text. Now, I specifically chose to discuss this work on a series pertaining to theories of personality because Fanon is actively engaged in conversation with theorists commonly discussed in this field, but also because the field itself is inundated with theorists who are predominantly white, male, and heterosexual. And finally, I've included this work because it provides a highly contrasting view and even critique of the models of personality typically represented. Let's look at an example to illustrate that last point. Now in chapter 6, we find addressed notions of neurosis and psychopathology from a psychoanalytic perspective. In psychoanalysis, as we've seen, psychological disorders have been conceptualized in terms of some conflict between, say, repressed desires, memories, and, in the case of Jung, universal archetypes that nonetheless find expression in everyday life through symptoms. These conflicts are understood to be mostly at the level of the individual and portrayed as individual problems to be addressed through individual psychoanalysis. Fanon sees the situation very differently. He sees neurosis in Black people as an expression of racism and colonialism. He also notes an emphasis in psychoanalysis on the interactions among members of the so-called nuclear family, in which there's a mother, father, and child. However, Fanon sees this family model as less applicable to the experience of the Black individual, whose family structures do not necessarily conform to this representation. And so he concludes the Black experience simply cannot be accounted for by the existing models provided by psychoanalysis, let alone those that are available in the broader field of psychology. And this is in spite of the fact that Fanon does continue to draw upon them and finds them helpful in some ways. So in considering the three pillars of nature, culture, and events that I described in the first video of this series, we find in Fanon's analyses a heavy emphasis on the role of culture in a manner that differs greatly from most models of personality. Culture, and more specifically racist culture, provides an understanding of nature, including interpretations that emphasize and indeed distort biological differences. Events are also shaped by culture, as the possibilities of one's individual experiences are greatly determined by restrictions and permissions put forth by society. At the same time, Fanon exposes the false generalizations that render different groups as culturally homogeneous, when in fact there is far greater diversity of experience within, say, Black individuals than these generalizations allow for. Fanon is a powerful example of this. His particular position in society uniquely situates him in a manner that can't be understood simply by reference to his racial identity, even if, as he argues, one can't understand him without accounting for this either. So thank you for watching this. The last time I posted a video was about 4 months ago as part of my Theories of Personality class, and really hadn't paid much attention to this channel, and only to find out that, at least relative to what I'm used to, the channel kind of exploded, mostly in relationship to the video on Carl Jung. So I wasn't expecting that, and I'm thinking about what to do with that. I had this series going, and my plan is to continue with this and to address various topics in psychology, but I also know that the overwhelming number of people who came to subscribe to this was because of the Jung series. So I would be interested in finding out what direction you, the subscribers, would like to go with this channel. I could hone in on Carl Jung and make this more of a focus on him, or continue to keep this as sort of broad summaries of particular texts within the field of psychology, and for this series within the field of theories of personality. So feel free to leave a comment below expressing some of your thoughts in regards to that, and until next time, be well.